Good morning, everyone. My name is Marvin Rotran. I'm the city councilor in the Snowden district. Accompanying me at the table from my extreme left, going rightwards, Mr. Jack Ideri, councilor in the city of Hampstead and one of the plaintiffs in this case, Mayor Mitchell Brownstein of Côte Saint-Luc, Mayor William Steinberg of the town of Hampstead. To my right, Beryl Wiseman, the editor of the suburban weekly newspaper. Missing this morning is Mr. Lawrence Bergman, former M&A for Darcy McGee, also plaintiff in the case, who unfortunately is ill and has conveyed his apologies. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to note in the room several personalities locally who support this case. Mr. Al Abdon, the president of the Filipino Heritage Month Committee, Mr. Paul Imperial, Madam Editha Fedeliso, who are here from the Panday Tinig group of the Filipino community, Mr. Norman Simon and Mr. Barry Simon from Canadians for Coexistence. This case has preoccupied the population of West End, Montreal, but it's not only a West End, Montreal case. It affects all of us in Quebec because the Quebec electoral map has distortions and variations in the number of voters per district that doesn't exist elsewhere in Canada. And in fact, a vote in Quebec is not necessarily equal depending where you live. The last provincial election was based on the report of the Commission électorale and the Director General of Elections of Quebec. The process began in 2015 and immediately provoked opposition in West End, Montreal. The proposal that was put forward was to take away one riding in Montreal, and specifically in the West End of the city, by radically altering the Darcy McGee district and fusing Mount Royal with Outremont. The protests of all the communities at that time, Côte Saint-Luc, Hampstead, town of Mount Royal, the boroughs of Outremont and Côte-Neige Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, which were adopted by resolutions of the various councils and made to the Electoral Commission, bore fruit. In February 2017, the riding map for our part of town was restored. We celebrated a little too prematurely. 3 weeks later, because of protests elsewhere in the province, the Director General of Elections proposed to go back to the initial proposal. Obviously, this provoked a great deal of anger in our part of Montreal, where residents felt that the Electoral Commission was susceptible to political pressure, was not neutral, was not sheltered from protests from different parts of the province, and had acted in a partisan fashion rather than in a neutral fashion that inspires confidence. A public meeting was held. Over 400 persons took part, and those persons gave a mandate to a number of individuals asking them to explore a legal case. Eventually, that legal case was filed. The lawyer of record is Maitre Julius Gray, and I'm proud to say today we will finally be in court on the 3rd of December. The case is backed up by all the communities in the area, some of which have generously contributed to the legal funds. In your press kit today, you'll note a document that shows what we mean when we say that there are some distortions in the electoral map. In Quebec, the law allows a riding to be plus or minus 25% from the average number of voters in the district. In other words, the law allows a huge discrepancy. Ridings can be effectively almost double the size of other ridings. But despite what the law says, which, by the way, is not the case in other provinces where the law allows only plus or minus 10%, such as Manitoba and New Brunswick, despite this, there are 6 ridings in Quebec that the law does not allow to be exceptions to the rule, which are below 25% less than the average. If you look at the bottom of your sheet, you will see those 6 ridings. Angava, Gaspé, Rennie-Lévesque, Abitibi East, Abitibi West, and Bonaventure. Those ridings are as much as 44% less population than the average. And we ask questions. Why do the people in Victoriaville have the largest riding in the province of Quebec with almost 60,500 voters, almost over 23% more than the norm, while people in Gaspé have a riding that's half the size with just over 30,000 voters. Why? It's not only a Montreal issue. This disparity affects people right across the province. And we've been saying this since the beginning, that we are seeking resolution to our complaint from the government of Quebec, and we are hoping the courts are going to back up our case and force the government of Quebec to look at the framework, the legislation, and the actions of the Director General of Elections in this particular case. We have said all along that we no longer live in an era where communications are such that rural areas need smaller ridings. We no longer live in the horse and buggy age. We live at a period of time where we have cell phones, email, Skype. A rural MNA no longer has to go on long voyages to meet his or her constituents. The rural MNA can do his or her job in the same way as an urban one. And thus, we argue the bonus that rural ridings have no longer needs to be conserved by the Director General of Elections. And as well, we argue that the overrepresentation in the National Assembly of rural ridings creates a dynamic that leads to laws that do not reflect the opinions of urban dwellers. And I point to Bill 21 as being a law where the point of view in Montreal is extremely different than it is in the regions of Quebec. And losing ridings, as Montreal has, one revision after another over the last several revisions, leads to loss of our voice. Finally, before I turn it over to Mitch Brownstein, our host today here in Côte Saint-Luc, I would point out the big losers in the electoral map affecting our part of town are ethnic and visible minorities. The Filipino community, which has been a strong support for this case since the beginning, is particularly impacted. A large group of voters in the former Mount Royal, they've been cut exactly in half now being in Mount Royal Outremont and half in Darcy-McGee, thus reducing their political weight. The Jewish community also has had a great concern about this particular case. The Jewish community finds that a share of their voters, formerly in Outremont, have been switched to Mercier, where they have very little impact on the final results. And the community, which was very large and strong in Darcy-McGee, now finds it has far less voting weight comparatively to everyone else in Darcy-McGee. We're also announcing today the opening of a GoFundMe page. This case has largely proceeded over the last 2.5 years through small donations for residents. We would urge everyone to go to our GoFundMe page, which you can find the address in the communique, and make your contribution. Your funds will go to help us defray the legal costs of this case. J'invite Mitch Brownstein. I invite Mitch Brownstein to speak on behalf of the City of Côte Saint-Luc.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. So the purpose of this press conference is primarily to get the necessary funds forward to pay for the case. The case is going forward. If we want it to succeed, we need to all contribute. The City of Côte Saint-Luc's contributed $7,000 and agreed to match funds up to a certain amount. So people have to go to the GoFundMe page and support the campaign. Now, this is a totally unfair situation, particularly for residents of Côte Saint-Luc. It's people who elect MNAs, not regions. And every individual should have the same vote and the same power, the same right to fair representation. It's not appropriate to look at it in terms of regions. You have to look at it as people. Well, that's what democracy is all about. So that's why we at the City of Côte Saint-Luc are strongly supporting this case. We want to make sure that every person has an equal vote and not that one riding has twice or even more than twice the influence from their vote than our vote. And right now, our vote has been diminished. The power, the strength of every person's vote in Côte Saint-Luc has been diminished to less than half of the vote from other ridings. So we need to contest this law strongly, and the only way that we can do that is in the courts. So make sure to support this financially so we take it right to the end, and our lawyer is telling us we have a very good case. So let's see this right to the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm going to ask Bill Steinberg, the Mayor of Hampstead, to speak. The town of Hampstead has generously agreed to donate $7,000 to the electoral fund, matching residents' donations. So Hampstead residents, if you don't donate, that money won't come into the case. So I'm urging all Hampstead residents to go to the GoFundMe page, make their contributions, or drop off their checks to Bill at Hampstead Town Hall. Bill.
As long as it's payable to Julius Gray in trust, not payable to me. I really don't have anything new to add, but I'll highlight a few of the points that I think are important. One of them is the fact that Montreal has been steadily losing representation since, I believe, 1990 or thereabouts. Every time they redo the electoral map, it's less clout for Montreal versus the regions. And the other point that I think is important is that the argument has always been, well, we need plus or minus 25% because we have some large ridings up in the north and up in the far east and whatever, and so you have to have these large ridings. Well, the fact is Manitoba has the same giant ridings way up in the north, and yet they have plus or minus 10%. And not only that, there's only 2 ridings that differ by more than 5%. So it's quite doable to have a much smaller variation. I also want to point out that this is not a case against the current or the previous Quebec government. This is a case against the DGEQ. However, the current government does have the power to change the law. They're talking about possibly mixed proportional representation, not in the near term, not for the next election, possibly for the election after. That may or may not improve the situation. And I don't have a particular opinion on mixed proportional representation, but if at that time they make the ridings, because you're still going to have local ridings and you're going to have regional ridings, and if you make those basically equal in size, varying by, let's say, plus or minus 10% at the most, then we'll have a much fairer system. And that may or may not happen, and if it doesn't happen, and in the shorter term, at least let's make the ridings plus or minus 10% now. I mean, it's outrageous to even have a plus or minus 25%. It's ridiculous. But on top of that, to have 6 more ridings that break the law, basically, where the law has just been ignored. 6 more ridings, even less, even a greater difference than 25%. And on top of that, there's Île-Madeleine, who have a special provision in the law, and they're even less again. So there's no reason for this. And it has been hurting Montreal at the expense of the regions, which has all kinds of implications, which I don't have to mention. So Hampstead has contributed $7,000 quite some time ago. We've urged our residents again to give some more, and we are matching whatever they give up to another $7,000. It's important for our residents, and I hope they will come out, they will contribute to the fund, and not just our residents, obviously Côte Saint-Luc, Côte NDG, Town of Mount Royal, Outremont, all of them are directly affected by this court challenge. And in the larger picture, really everybody in Montreal is indirectly affected. So I hope people will donate, and a whole bunch of little donations add up pretty quickly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to have Beryl Wiseman, who is a plaintiff, speak, and then I'll conclude it with Jack Aderi, who's also a plaintiff. Beryl.
Thank you, Marvin. My remarks will be very short, but first I want to thank Marvin Rotran for exceptional work in this cause, and to thank Mayor Steinberg, Mayor Brownstein. I have to mention Mayor Philippe Roy of TMR also for moral and material support going above and beyond. It is absurd that a society like Quebec that has spent record amounts on diversity funding has taken away the most important service and right to an area of the largest concentration of cultural and ethnic communities in the province. That was the riding of Mount Royal. It is not only disenfranchising citizens of their most important power, a voice in the National Assembly, but it is going above and beyond in this whole incident of responding to political pressures and public pressures. It is sad that justice takes so long and costs so much. But there is one overriding element in this case. The rules that govern the Director General of Elections of Quebec clearly state that no public or political consideration shall be taken into account when reaching a decision. The Director General of Elections, as Marvin stated, in February, had made clear that Mount Royal riding and the other two ridings would stay as it is. Manon Massé, the member of the National Assembly, for her riding that was then supposed to be eliminated, went into the streets and said, among other statements, and represented her community well, and said that the gay community needs its own voice in the National Assembly because her riding has such great concentration. How much more so do 27 ethnic communities need their own voice in the National Assembly? How much more so does the second greatest pocket of poverty on the island of Montreal, next to Hochelaga-Maisonneuve, need their own voice in the National Assembly? This is not a matter of people of means, of people of privilege demanding their representative back. This is a matter of people for whom government must function best, having their voice silenced in the National Assembly. And my final point is, as media, we have been called since the time of Napoleon the fourth estate of government, after the executive and the legislative and the judiciary. But in order for us to be effective, we need to make sure that the legislative arm particularly represents the people. There was no excuse for this decision. There should be no reason to lose this case. And I want to thank not just the residents of Mount Royal, but the residents of all of Montreal who have been so supportive of this effort over the past several years, morally and materially, and we ask you to go with us that one last extra mile as we come to what will hopefully be a successful conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beryl. Before I give it to Jack, I want to recognize a few people in the room. My apologies, I forgot to announce Councillor Torgman from the City of Côte Saint-Luc, who is here with us today. I also note the presence of Ms. Lilia Esguerra, the president of FILGA, an organization that works with Filipino seniors. I recognize again the leading role that Filipinos in our part of town have played in this struggle, since they are so affected by the new boundaries and the loss of a riding in our sector. I also note the presence of Mr. Armand Jajabi, who is staff person to Pierre Arcon, the MNA of Mount Royal, and Ms. Liz Praz and Mr. Chris Savard, representing David Birnbaum, the MNA of Darcy McGee. Concluding our part of the press conference, I'll ask Jack Hederi, who is councillor in Hampstead and has been one of the plaintiffs and has pushed this case forward, to address us.
It's essentially a question that's very fundamental to our society. Are we or are we not a democracy? And I think the reason that I'm a plaintiff is that if half of the voices that are voting have no value, then I don't see how we can legitimately call ourselves a democracy. And that's really what it comes down to. You have to be able to listen to the people, but if at the end of the day, half of the voices in our riding mean nothing, then those people are disenfranchised, those people essentially have no say, and I don't think we have the privilege to call ourselves a democracy.
Thank you, Jack. I'll conclude by saying this does have province-wide impact. If we win this case, it will force a complete rethink of the electoral map. It's true the government has mulled changing the electoral system. That's well in the future. But the least that can be done, and it can be done quickly if the government's committed to it, is changing the norms of the variation between electoral districts. That will satisfy us. We're open to suggestion, but we will be in court on December 3rd if we don't come to some sort of conclusion with the DGEQ before then. Thank you. J'invite les médias de poser les questions. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions en français des médias? Sinon, on va aller we're going to go to questions in English. Catherine Wilton.
$7,000 we're donating. Up to a certain amount, yeah. Ours is 7. Ours approved to date is 3. We'll match up to 3, and we're donating 7. I believe we've already donated 7.
And it's Hampstead that's just announced a new $7,000. Absolutely, after the press conference. Any other media have any questions?
Is there any specific effect of this past election, which the writing change already put into effect, you can point out to the court had a negative effect?
Well, the court, all the testimony has already been given. The judge is going to basically rule on the discovery of the plaintiffs by the DGEQ and the information that was given. I don't think any new evidence will be presented. Our case is clear. There are 6 writings that exist on no legal basis other than the discretion of the DGEQ. The DGEQ had other options than to take away a writing in Montreal. The impact of that is to reduce the voice of minorities as well, while reducing the voice of the Métropole de Quebec in the National Assembly. We felt we provided evidence that is done differently elsewhere in a fairer sort of way. We think that the courts will likely back us up, and as such, we have embarked on this not because we want to be in a dispute with the government. It's costly and it's difficult, and it's a David and Goliath struggle, and we see ourselves as David. It has been financed by small donations from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And when you can get 400 people to turn out on a cold night in March of 2017 because this had an impact on them, I think it shows that the community is concerned. And I point out again that all the towns and all the boroughs have adopted motions of support for the court case.
But let me just add, to your question directly, people tend to look at what is the effect in an election. That's not where you look. You look every day. And perhaps I, more than anyone at this table, in getting the phone calls from people who can't be served by what is now called Montréal Outremont, and they can't be served by being in Mercier, and they have trouble even being served in Darcy McGee because they're so big. It's every day that people have problems. As a former chief of staff, Derwin Cotler, I know how many calls flood the offices of public officials, of real problems, of pension checks being lost, of citizenship issues, immigration issues, the 1,001 things that you have to deal with, and particularly in Quebec that is such a burden of compliance. That is what is being lost every single day. People's needs aren't being met. People's suffering is not being eliminated. Injustices are not being cured because the people aren't there. The government, the Director General of Elections has decided simply to remove a level of support for a vulnerable area by fiat and in reaction to opposition of removing another seat, that of Madame Nassay's and in her argument for the LGBTQ community, an argument that was proper, and the same argument we make for the cultural communities of Mount Royal. It's an everyday problem. It's not a matter of just the vote.
If there are no other questions, I will call the...
Just one other thing, specific thing, Bill 21. I don't think Bill 21 would have happened if we had proper proportional representation.
Thank you. I'm going to invite the media to do one-on-one interviews with whoever they would like at the front table, and I thank you all for coming. I particularly appreciate the presence of the citizens who came to show the support of their organizations today. It is very much appreciated. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.